Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi everyone. Today we have another session for the applied Sira. Sister Misbah will present his topic on the dynasties of the Pharaoh. So, Sister Misbah, please go ahead.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I would give just a quick overview of previous presentation. So all dynasties starting from 12 to 13 is Middle Kingdom. That's the possible time of Ibrahim alayhi salam. 13th dynasty when Egypt was really weak, in a really weak state. And that's the time before Yusuf alayhi salam. Then 15th dynasty. And then 15th dynasty, the time of Hyksos rule. That was the time of Yusuf alayhi salam. Then Ahmos Ahmos the first or one, whatever you say, he expelled Hyksos from Egypt. That was the time of 18th dynasty. Then 18th dynasty flourished in New Kingdom. That was the time of rising of Egyptian power. And then 1300 to 1200 BC, that was the time of Ramesses II, the pharaoh of Musa alayhi salam. So in every dynasty, they had a different god. They used to believe in a different god, sometimes a fusion of gods. So the most important time was in Old Kingdom, that was Ra, the sun god. Then intermediate time, that was the weak time of Egypt. That was the local deities most of the times. Then Middle Kingdom from 11th to 13th dynasty, that was time of Amun. Then second intermediate time, that was the time of Hyksos, and they brought their own dogma and their own belief of Baal. But Baal had you can say resemblance with, not the physical resemblance, but his attributes were similar with the Seth. He's called Seth and Set both. So they both were different gods, but their attributes were the same. And then New Kingdom, from 18th to 20th, that was Amun and Ra, fusion of two gods, Amun and Ra. So the time of Heliopolitan Ennead, that was the cluster of 9 gods. So Atum, he's the creator god. He self-generated from the primordial waters of Nun, and he's often depicted in hieroglyphs as a king, like who's wearing 2 crowns, and like double crown, one for Upper and one for Lower Egypt. So Atum is the creation. He's the creator. He created all the other gods, and Shu is the god of air. Tefnut is the goddess of rain. Geb is god of earth. Nut is the goddess of sky. Osiris is the god of afterlife. Isis is the goddess of magic and motherhood. Seth is the god of chaos and storms. Nephthys, she's the goddess of mourning and protection. So these people, they used to believe in magic. They used to call it Hika, but they had concept of prayer, but it existed alongside a robust belief in magic. Hika was like a divine power. So they used to think that magic is not superstition. They used to take it as a legitimate force created by the gods and even used by the gods themselves. So Egyptians, they definitely prayed to the gods, but they also believed in empowering themselves through magic, not because they lack piety. They say we don't lack piety, but because we view the world as full of divine forces that could be accessed and activated through both devotion and technique, and that technique was Hika, magic. Then that was they used to believe in the this triad of Osirian triad. That's the trinity of Osiris, referring to a sacred family group of 3 major deities in ancient Egyptian religion. There was father, mother, and son. So Osiris, he's the father. He's the father, and he is the universal god of the dead. And they used to believe every deceased person after life, if they are good enough, they can become Osiris. And Isis is the mother. She's the wife of Osiris, and she's a goddess of magic, motherhood, and healing. Then there's their son, Horus. He's the falcon god. His name is the title of every pharaoh as well. So Osiris used to have a book of death, a collection of funerary texts used from the New Kingdom, circa 1550 BCE onwards. Then in 15th dynasty, that's the time of Hyksos. So that's the time period of Yusuf al-Islam as a ruler, because circumstantial evidences pointing to the facts of the time of famine and prosperity. So the Hyksos hate rhetoric, it had for some, they used to hate him so much, the Egyptian, because he was the foreigner. I mean, all of those Hyksos rulers, they were foreigner. So they expunged his name. And because Yusuf al-Islam, he also ruled at this time. So his details are also gone from the history, and you won't see him in any hieroglyphs. So, and Quran, historically, accuracy of Quran is like at this time, king was called king. So Quran addressed all the kings in the Hyksos time as Malik. The pharaoh is called when it's time Musa alayhi salam. So that's the place where, that's the Levant where Hyksos came from. That's the Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and present-day Palestine. They ruled this Lower Egypt, this area, and this area, city of Avaris, used to be their capital. So, and this was the area of Upper Egypt, which was ruled by Egyptian, mostly Egyptian prince. So this area is called Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, because the Egyptians, they don't go by the compass rule, like they don't according to, they won't go according to compass, but the flow of River Nile, because this was the hilly area, so River Nile go from here to down here in the Lower Egypt, and because of the flow of Nile River, this is called Lower Egypt and this is called Upper Egypt. Hyksos, they used to believe in Baal. That was the god, that was Canaanite god of rain. So that area of Levant is called Canaanite. So his domain was rain, storm, thunder, fertility, and war. They also somehow, you can say, supported Seth as well, because this is Seth, and he's some strange animal or bird mixture hybrid. And Seth is the god of chaos, desert, storms, violence, disorder, and sometimes protection as well. So Hyksos favored Seth because of his attributes are the same as Baal. And there are so many temples associated with both of them. You will see temples inscription showing Baal Seth association. Later in the New Kingdom, even after the Hyksos were expelled, Baal's influence persisted. So that's the 18th dynasty, time of Ahmose. He is the one who threw all the Hyksos out of the Egypt, and he made them leave the Egypt. So that was the time of New Kingdom, liberation of Egypt, and a national revival of Egyptian authority and identity. So he also revived the divine ruler concept. Divine ruler concept was that whatever person or king who is ruling, he's a godhead as well. So the worst part was for of this time was the consequences which were suffered by Israelites due to their close cultural, linguistic, and political ties with the Hyksos. The Israelites were viewed with suspicion. So Egyptians, they despised them. They despised them so much. They view them as collaborators or spies of Hyksos, and they did not give them any respect after that time. This hostility may have laid the groundwork for later enslavement of Israelites during the time of Musa alayhi salam, but there's much more to that, so we'll discuss it later on. They used to believe in in this time, Ahmed's time, they used to believe in two gods of Ra, the sun god, and Amun, the god of invisibility. They used to say that he's invisible, but Amun is present in everything. So Amun symbolic animal was a giant ram, and Ra's symbolic animal was a falcon. And he used to travel in a golden bark and used to go in underworld at night time. So then is 19th dynasty, circa 1292 to 1189 BCE. That was one of the most important time for Egyptian history because it started the Ramesside line. Ramesses I, the grandfather, Seti I, the father, and Ramesses II, the son of Seti I, the grandson, who was the pharaoh of Musa alayhi salam as well. So Ramesses I, he was like a normal man raised to royalty because he wasn't, his background wasn't even military or royal family. He was a normal man. But then there was a king called Horemheb. He used to be really loyal to him. And that king, he was childless. And Ramesses I, what he did, he proved his loyalty to him, his capability to him. So Horemheb, he was aging, he was older and childless. So the urgency of all these things demanded that he hand over the the rulership to somebody who he can trust. So Ramesses I, he became a co-regent, a co-ruler with the Horemheb. And then he did so many expedition restorations. One of them was Sinai turquoise mines. Because those mines were like, it was a dangerous expedition and needed a lot of support from government because sometimes there were, you can say, some people like who are waiting for them outside, like you can say gangs of people who can attack them and take them turquoise from them, and that's why they needed government support, and it was going into mine was dangerous expedition. Since it wasn't supported by government, so it stopped, and then Ramesses I, he restarted again, and then he restored the worship of Hathor as well. Hathor was the cow goddess, the hybrid of cow and woman. And this after Ramesses I, the Ramesside line also started. Then his son Seti I came, and his reign was really small, from 17 to 24 months. He restored everything his father left, and he also, especially he, again, after his father, there was a time that Sinai turquoise mines, they were closed. So he reopened them, especially at Sarabat al-Khadam and Wadi Magara, and restored the worship of Hathor, the protector of miners. So at that time, they used to believe in this triad. That's the father, son, and mother. So that was because Memphis was the main capital. So they, whoever was worshipped in Memphis, that was worshipped in the whole state. So this trinity was the state god trinity. So that's called Memphite triad. That was Ptah, the creator. He created the creation with intellectual and spiritual knowledge, and so the word emerged from divine thought and speech. And then his wife, Sekhmet, she's the lioness goddess of war and healing. And then their son, Nefertum, he's the god of lotus and perfumes. So this triad formed the Memphis triad. Then there is Ramesses II, the pharaoh of Exodus, Musa alayhi salam's time. He did many expeditions. One of was that the Battle of Kadesh. That was indecisive war of Kadesh, the biggest chariot war of history. And after that, it was indecisive. So they signed the first peace treaty of history. Basically, Qadesh was in the control of Hittites because fight was with Hittites, and but Pharaoh Ramesses II, he claimed to win it and build statues in his honor. Hittites, they came from Anatolia, the present-day Turkey, and Qadesh was the war which was battled here. And then the Hittites, they took this part was the Canaan and Syria and Palestine. That was the part where they were fighting. And Ramesses II, he took the control of Nubia because here there were gold and timber supply used to come from here. So he built a border control here to control all the gold and timber. In these different times, Amun-Ra, the fusion of Amun, the god of invisibility, and Ra, the god of sun, it was worshipped at that time in different times, but most important time was the New Kingdom time of Ahmose I, the 18th dynasty, and Ramesses II, the 19th dynasty. He used to call him the favorite of Amun-Ra. So he, in his honor, the temples were built in Karnak, and although they used to say that Amun-Ra is the creator of the universe and king of all the gods. Now, the most strangest thing, if we go back and we see that Amun-Ra, he's holding a staff kind of thing in his hand. It's called was scepter. And in the other hand, he's holding a key loop kind of thing. It's called Ankh. So it's like was considered the sign of power. So if we see Musa al-Islam, he also used to hold a staff in his hand. So universally, we see the staff was the universal symbol of authority. So holding a staff has been a symbol of authority, leadership, and power for thousands of years. So across many cultures, if we see the use of staff, it goes back to 5,000 years, possibly. And they used to use it like it was a different perspective. It can be a practical, if we see in the practical aspect, the role of staff was like walking aid or herding tool for the shepherds. Socially, if we see, that used to be the mark of a leader. Whoever is holding is the leader. And spiritually, priests, they used to link it with the divine or spirit, like they are performing some kind of rituals and using the staff. They're using showing as an act that we are doing something with it. And if we see in a visual perspective, it was sign of authority and visibility from, and making people more visible, whoever is holding among other people. So if we see in ancient Egypt, 3000 BC and onwards, pharaohs and gods were often depicted with the crook and flail, symbol of kingship and divine rule. So the crook, it was like a shepherd's staff. It symbolized guidance and protection for of the people. So was scepter gets its name from the ancient Egypt word was. It's pronounced exactly the same as English word was, which means power, dominion, or authority. So the a symbol which looks like a cross with a loop said this is called Ankh, the key of life, the breath of life. So many staffs. If we see Amun-Ra's staff, it has a falcon head. But so many gods, they have their deities, they have the picture of Ankh as well on the top of the, instead of a animal face or animal head, it was like a symbol of Ankh. And Ankh is the most powerful and recognizable symbols in ancient Egyptian religion. And it represents life, immortality, divine power, and the connection between the mortal and divine worlds. And whoever holds it, it means that they are showing that they are holding something really powerful. And if we see so many hieroglyphs, it shows that pharaohs are holding it, or gods are holding it and pressing it against the noses of pharaohs, symbolizing like it's giving the birth of life, and strange kind of concepts. So when we see Asa of Musa alayhi salam, we can see a cultural context of ancient Egypt. It's clear because for them, like for the ancient time, a staff is universal symbol of leadership. And then Allah may have chosen a familiar symbol to communicate divine power in a way that resonated with both Israelites and Egyptians. So was scepter symbolism, it represented power and divine authority. So when people of Egypt, they would see a staff in Musa alayhi salam's hand, they would understand authority and divinity. And when they saw that this staff, it performs miracles, the Musa alayhi salam staff, it was functional, it was a divine symbol, which actually rivaled with the symbols of pharaohs. And somehow it overthrew the Egyptian symbols, because they were just, you can say they were just symbolic. They don't do anything. And staff of Musa alayhi salam, it was a living miracle in itself, and it wasn't symbolic, it was functional. So if we see in Surah Bani Israel, verse number 81, says, and proclaim, the truth has come and falsehood has vanished. Surely falsehood is ever bound to vanish. So Musa alayhi salam's staff, it turned into a serpent, defeating the illusionist magic of Pharaoh's magician. So it can be viewed as Allah directly confronting and overpowering the religious political symbols of Egypt. That was scepter. And they had the symbols of serpents on the crown. So it clearly shows that Allah has overthrown all of those their claims of what they can do with that. So this can be viewed directly like it's a miracle in itself. So what they were doing, Allah has outmatched and neutralized Egyptian religious symbol in a very divine way. So if we see that it's some kind of symbolic reversal from oppression to divine, the real divine, which is not just the way they claim. It was, you can say, it was a symbol of Tawheed, not a shirk. So it was breaking all the concept of shirk. So if we see the pagan stuff was like symbol of divinity and control, but pagan control. And Musa alayhi salam staff, it's like true divine guidance. The war scepter is ceremonial and visual, and then Musa alayhi salam's asa, it split seas and it transformed. So it was a living miracle for them and for everybody. So okay, so it's something like it's the victory of truth over illusion. So it's like a tool which shattered political and religious and even magical authority of the most powerful civilization of that time, which was Egypt. So it was a victory of truth over illusion. Now, pharaohs, they were centralized authority. They used to have many privileges because of what they were enjoying being as a pharaoh in 19th dynasty. So they were enjoying the absolute power. The pharaoh was the sole ruler and supreme lawgiver. His words was law. All state decisions, military, administrative, judicial, everything needed his approval. So even when Pharaoh, he used to appoint wazirs or governors and high officials, he would say that who gonna be who. So his permission was needed in everything. Then he was enjoying divine status as well. He was considered the living god, specifically the earthly embodiment of Horus and the son of Ra. So he used to say that I am their representative, the God's representative on earth. So all the pharaohs, they used to claim that. So he was like a divine ruler, and he was calling himself a mediator between gods and people. And he used to say, I'm upholding the the cosmic order. I'm going to discuss it later on. So then he used to call himself the son of Ra. In the start, Ra was like a local, you can say, a local deity by the second dynasty. By the fourth dynasty, pharaohs were like seen as his earthly manifestation. They used to call themselves the son of Ra. So they used to, because of this, they used to enjoy so many status. If we see, there's a historian called Gary Shaw. He wrote a book, The Pharaoh Life at Court and on Campaign. He said, the pharaoh was not just a ruler, but also the high priest, judge, lawgiver, army leader, and their reign was celebrated through elaborated coronation and funerary rites and rituals. So we can say the rise of pharaoh, it involved both linguistic evolution and ideological development throughout the time. So they had control over wealth and economy of Egypt as well. So they had access to state treasuries, temple wealth, and agriculture produce. Even they owned vast lands, mines like gold from Nubia and other luxury resources. They collected taxes in the form of grain, cattle, and labor, and even in the form of slaves. They used to have supreme military command. So if we see that pharaohs they were commander-in-chief of the army as well. They led army campaigns, particularly in Canaan, Nubia, and Libya. And when they win, even sometimes when they don't win, they used to have all the spoils of war and slaves and territory. And after that, they used to build statues in their honor. And sometimes even built temples as well. So Ramesses II, he built the Ramesseum and Abu Simbel temples in his honor, and his name is inscribed on monuments across Egypt and Nubia. So they were religious authority as well. Obviously, they had exclusive right to commission temples and appoint high priest. So these priests, they used to celebrate some kind of religious festivals as well. And in those festivals, the main central authority and central figure would be Pharaoh. So as a royal family, I mean, all the pharaohs, they used to enjoy the privileges of being a royal family as well. They used to have multiple wives and concubines, but they were not just any women. They were women from royal or noble lineage. So their sons were trained for military and political leadership, and their daughters, they could become priestess or marry into foreign royalty as well. It was just their choice. So the great royal wife held special religious and political roles. So they also used to enjoy the international prestige as well. They used to receive tributes and gifts from different states or allies or and whatever were the neighboring states as well. So from Hittite, Babylon, and Cyprus, Babylus and Cyprus. They also engage in diplomatic marriages as well. So if we see Ramesses II, he married a Hittite princess after the Battle of Kadesh to make peace treaty even more stronger. And he used to host foreign emissaries in very luxurious way as well. And if we talk about knowledge, they had access to knowledge and magic in every way possible. They used to support scribes, architects, priests, and scholars. And they had access to magical rituals, secret texts, and healing arts through temple priests as well. And they used to teach them all of that. So, and that the special ritual was associated with Maat, the cosmic order and truth. Their lifestyle, it was luxurious, and they used to live in lavish palaces with fine gardens, pools, and art. They used to enjoy exotic food, perfumes, and fine clothing and music. They used to attend grand feasts and hunting trips. They used to hunt mostly lions and tigers. It was considered the royal support. So, and there used to be some special kind of boat processions on Nile, River Nile. So they used to attend them as well. So with all of that, they had five-fold titulary. They used to hold 5 titles as a pharaoh. It was Horus, the falcon, Nebti, the two ladies of, you can say, two goddesses. One was Bajat and one was Nakbat. Nakbat, she was a vulture and woman hybrid. And Wajat, she was the snake and woman hybrid. So Nakbat, her role was like a protective goddess, primarily of Upper Egypt, which is, and she is like a vulture. So her main domain was she was the patron of Pharaoh, and she's shown like a spreading her wings above the king, like she's protecting him like a mother. And like this symbol is like a symbol of royal authority and divine protection. Why the vulture? Because the first thing come to your mind, or it came to my mind, it will come to your mind as well, that vultures, how can they be symbol of protection and kingship? Because we consider them like a um, low rank animal which eat dead. And but Egyptian, they were very keen observers. They used to see that vultures, they are highly attentive mothers. They believe all the vultures were female, likely because male vultures are less prominent, or maybe um, for some other reason, but they used to think that all the vultures are female. And if you read ancient text of Egypt, they would call all of them like female. And they used to protect their kids enough, like they're very observant in the sky, and they used to protect the kids really closely, like keep an eye on them. So they were considered like pure motherhood and divine maternity. So even on Pharaoh's throne, Nakbat, the vulture goddess, is spreading her wings to protect the sun, just like a mother bird shielding her young. So that vulture became a symbol of maternal protection, perfect for safeguarding the king, who is like a child to Nakbat. And also that Wajat, um, she's a cobra. It's like a cobra goddess of protection and motherhood. She was like showing that behind a pharaoh, she's like raising her head and like very attentive when cobra is about to strike. The way cobra makes like canopy of the head, and then um, protects that herself. Or even the same thing goes for cobra as well, or like a motherhood or protection if it's a female cobra. And that's definitely Vajat is a female cobra. So the readiness to strike at threats, and she is considered like the way is very quick to strike and very precise. So she's considered the ultimate guardian. So her stance is called the ultimate guardian stance when she's in pictures, the way she is being depicted, like and the preciseness of when a snake strike or bite or sting is like really precise and very quick, that it's hard to you can say hard to save for a person, no matter how quick they are. So Vajat is also symbol of motherhood. So, and it lives the symbolic thing about it is that falcon and vulture, they protect the throne from up in the sky because they fly. And Vajat, the snake, it lives close to earth. It emerges from underworld, like you can say in symbolically underworld. So it's associated with regeneration and rebirth. And the way snake, they shed their skin, they become a symbol of renewal and eternity. because there are stories about that snake. They don't die, and they are for like eternal. So they're called because Nepti in Egypt means two ladies. So these two ladies together, they are very powerful female deities for Egyptian. So, and they also hold a golden Horus name as well. It's like same falcon, but a golden falcon, like with more power. And then they used to have their throne name and their birth name. So these were the 5 titles for pharaohs. The most strangest thing come to anybody's mind, that why the Egyptian, they used to imagine gods in a physical form. Because in ancient Egypt, they did not believe that, or they did not imagine as in gods to be invisible or abstract, but they often show them in physical form, because they used to visually represent God in a powerful symbolic creature to express strength or wisdom or fertility or protection. That's why they used to make like animal and human hybrid. They wanted a tangible form they can see. And the second thing is they had the strange logic behind animal hybrid, because they used to say this is just a symbol. We are not, you can say, we are not worshiping the animal, we are worshiping the symbol behind it. They say that certain animals, they expressed divine qualities better than humans. Like for example, the falcon, it has sharp vision, high perspective, so it used for Horus, god of kingship. Cobra is the protection or sudden strike, that's Vajat, protective goddess. So an ibis, there's a bird which is like really precise, and when the precision and calculation of his hunting style and everything was considered like this must be the god of calculation and balance and stuff. So they saw the natural world as filled with signs of divine. So they say animals were symbols of power, beauty, and fertility. And hybrid forms, they were bridging human and divine. Human body plus animal head. It showed that gods communicate with humans. Like that's more relatable. But still, they say it's a supernatural power of animals. It's something they used to call it like it's something symbolic, but a mythical coding. They mix human and animal features to represent divine complexity. So the magic of nature, they used to say that these are the animals they represent forces they actually fear or admire. Like if we see Nile crocodile, the god, they call him Sobek. It was there was fear associated with it. So some things like they used to fear, and some animals they used to admire, like Bastet, that's the cat hybrid goddess. So they did not separate the sacred and the natural. They mix it up, and like there are cognitive limitations for human minds thinks in images. So instead of learning or understanding, they relate the word with form, metaphors, and comparisons. So they couldn't there's a lack of abstract realities like infinity, eternity, or unseen things. Instead of thinking them in an abstract form, they used to think that this is the tangible form or physical form, because these concepts are difficult to grasp without symbols. Like they associate symbols with everything, like it's a protection or divine power. They would make a picture of it. So there was a psychological need for connection. They used to think that if God is to care about me, God must be like me. And they say they want to feel closer to God, feel closer to divine power. So if for them it was easier to relate to a being which speaks or walks or like even loves and punishes, like a parent or king. So they used to associate God with animals and humans. So they used to imagine gods as superhuman or animal or animal human hybrids. So it was like they used to think that symbolism is the language of the sacred. The form isn't the god, it's a symbol. And we see that Quran tells us this is what Quran say, that you shouldn't like mistake creation for the creator. There is a huge you can say a really big line between creation and creator. So Islam, it believes in it, Islam challenges it, because this is the trap for idolatry. Even some modern minds, they fail to see the subtle line between this symbolism and idolatry, because it's very sneakily bring people, they say symbol and stuff, and then they start worshipping the symbol. So Quran says, Allah says in Quran many times that there is nothing like Allah, and you cannot imagine it. We have not given the capacity or capability to imagine Allah. So it's better to stay away from it. So when we know Allah is beyond comprehension, yet closer to our soul, closer than anything to our souls, then all this knowledge of Tawheed, it comes from not forming a shape, but it comes from revelation, Quranic revelation, holy books. And we are supposed to reflect on it, and then submission is the key. So Islam calls humans to transcend symbolic thinking and then rise to intellectual and spiritual abstraction. So we don't need to visualize things. We don't need to project our emotions onto God. We don't need to worship the symbols. And in Surah Baqarah, Allah says He knows what is before them and behind them, but they encompass nothing of His knowledge. So it's verse number 255, Surah Baqarah. So we know that we have limited imagination, we have limited abilities, and Allah has already revealed Himself through words, guidance, and truth. So we don't need to shrink God to an image. We need to expand our hearts to His supremacy. But still, humans, we are like really attracted to myth and symbolism, because we, as a human, we are wired for stories. We are really wired for something which makes sense through a word, through narratives, through symbols and personification. So in ancient times, the natural forces like sun, moon, or changing weather, or storms, or flood, they used to be very mysterious and frightening. So people used to explain them through myth. And some you can say a few things, or there some concepts were like really abstract. They were really difficult to understand. So people, they used to use the symbols to make them tangible, and then to make them understand. And you can see that gods with animal heads, stories of divine battles, or mystic objects made the unseen, whatever they were scared of, feel real and memorable, and something which used to calm them, calm their fear. So religion then became emotionally compelling for them, because they were not when they were intellectually challenged, they were not trying to use their brain, they were not trying to think over it and try to understand it. They were just making the myths and fantasy about it, because it was giving them comfort and control. And because of these concepts, their spiritual growth was stunned. It stopped. They also use it for psychological comfort, for the psychological comfort. Sorry. So they say fantasy is giving us control, and it somehow domesticated the chaos which was going on around them. And but then if we see the how they used to symbolize a calf for maternity, or you can say bull or cow for maternity and protection and motherhood. And then they started worshipping the same symbol and that golden calf incident, and it made them feel like they are something formless or unseen, became divine for them as a tangible object and was right in front of them. So the symbolism, it's somehow very seductively pull people into idolatry, and they start creating the images of gods, and religion, it turns into indulgence and ritual rather than transforming their everything around them into a truth, into a tool to reach Allah. It turned into shirk. So Islam, it viewed like Islam purified religion from myth. And Allah said in Surah Najm, verse number 23, they follow nothing but conjecture and what their soul desire. So Quran, Islam had removed all the man-made myths from people's life, but then they changed the holy scriptures as well. And Allah said in Surah Shura, there, verse number 11, God is not like anything we can imagine. So again, limited capability as a human. So Allah said that you need to reflect, you need to submit to unseen, you need to rise above myth and fantasy to find the God, to reach to Tawheed. In Egypt, ancient Egypt, time of Pharaoh, we talk about Pharaoh, the Pharaoh of Moses, alayhi salam. He used to say that I'm cosmic linchpin, I'm the upholder of Maat, and I am the one who is keeping the cosmic order and balance. So what is Maat? Maat, in a theoretical, Maat is the principle of harmony. And physically, they personify it as a goddess. Maat is the foundation of cosmos. And she's the one who is like wearing a crown with the wing, and that wing, that feather is like, she put, when a person dies, she put it next to his heart, and if his heart is full with evil, which is Isfat. Isfat is not the concept of God, but Isfat is an embodiment of evil. So it's the opposite of Maat, but not a god or anything. It's just a concept or opposite of what you call embodiment of evil. So every sunrise was seen as a victory of Maat over Isfat, because uh, how they say that Isfat is also called Apep, and he's the serpent of chaos who tries to stop the sun god Ra each night. So every night he fights with sun god Ra, and every morning when sun rises again, that's the victory of Maat and defeat of Isfat. So this is the Egyptians, they had the myth that there's a cosmic struggle going on every day, and the world was not automatically stable by Allah. They say that balance is because of Maat, the goddess of balance. And the most important role of Maat, the goddess, was that she is keeping the river Nile calm. It's not dry, it's not flooding, it should be calm, flowing really calmly. So they had really strange concept, and even after life, the weighing of the heart, it judges the soul. So Isfat is the evil which is in the heart, and if it's not present, the person can go to afterlife, the eternal life. Pharaoh, they used to say, we are upholding Maat, and we are cosmic linchpin, and we are the mediator between God and human, and we are the guardian of justice and a symbol of stability. So, and it is also shown in the temple art in Karnak and Luxor. Pharaohs are offering a figure of Maat to gods, like physically holding Maat as a symbol in their hand and offering to the gods, and declaring that I, the king, sustain the divine order. So it's this inscription is written in the temples of Karnak and Luxor. So The strangest thing is that this Egyptian doctrine of Maat, it's like it highlights the ethical and cosmic foundation of Egyptian life. They used to think it in a very, I would say, childish story-like thing, that whatever is going on. But when I was researching that, and I saw that something like it all of a sudden raised a question, like the way he used to claim, because I got confused that who was the one who that said that I can raise, I can give life, and that was the debate of Ibrahim alayhis salam with Namrud. And all of a sudden, I started feeling like he was the one, the Pharaoh is the one who claimed to do that. So did Namrud do the same thing? So I saw so many similarities between Namrud and Pharaoh, the Ramesses II. They both claimed the divinity. They both said we are Godhead. They both made the religion which was centered around them. They were the center of their religious system. Then they used religion for control, like controlling all the people in their state. Then they had a really strange kind of ritual system, which was like strange kind of rituals, and they were the main figure of that. They both built monumental symbolic architectures. Pharaoh, he built pyramids, and Nimrud, he built ziggurats. And for they both were archetype of tyranny, and this is how they used to control people. Nimrud, he used to control them, that this is the Babylonian ziggurats, which were like designed in the name of cosmic access. Like this is the physical location where the divine and human realms intersected. And Nimrud, who used to commission and control these sacred structures, like they positioned themselves within a cosmic religious architecture of authority. So they created fear in people's heart of them being. They used to give really, you can say, severe punishment for to the people who are not um, uh, accommodating their idea of rulership, or anything they would do. They would make those people the symbol of. You can say everybody will take inspiration from. Like how you said, inspiration, that this is the god, and if you go against this god, he gonna do this to you. So they were kind of threat for everybody. They would set an example after giving punishment to those people. So they both were symbol of arrogance. They were very, very arrogant, and they both ruled really powerful empires. And they both use different form of, one use magic and the other use astrology, a different form of means to control. Pharaoh used magic, and Nimrud, he used astrology to control people. Then they both have Israelite traditions about them. Both were told that one boy would destroy their godhead, and then he would raise to a power, and then take away their rulership from them. They both opposed a prophet. Nimrud opposed Ibrahim alayhis salam, and Pharaoh opposed Moses alayhis salam. Then they claimed to be cosmic linchpin. When Ibrahim alayhis salam said to Nimrud that there was a debate going on, and Nimrud, he claimed that arrogantly, he said, I too give life and death, like maybe possibly killing somebody or sparing a prisoner's life. And then Ibrahim alayhis salam challenged him that Allah brings the sun from the east, bring it from the west. And Nimrud, he had no reply. So Pharaoh, he actually claimed to maintain cosmic balance with um, whatever they had, that theory or their mythology of Maat and Isfat. And Nimrud, he used to control it with a proper location, like a physical location of cosmos axis. So they both had so many similarities because they are both like a typical villain. He's all the time how Bani Israel, they've been suffering, or what they were doing at that time, what kind of conditions they were going through. So in many places we see that, everywhere actually, the way the Jews claim that they used to be treated really badly, they had the toughest time, and with that they claimed in about so many things. First, we have, I've already discussed about Israelites being outsiders. They were living there for so many dynasties, they were still considered outsider. The minute the Hyksos, they were expelled, obviously they were Semitic and they both shared the same kind of culture. When they were gone, they were seen as a threat. They were seen as an outsider, a foreigner, community who's still there, and everyone should be aware of them. They were treated like cast out. So, but Torah claimed that Israelite outnumbered Egyptians. When we see that, it deemed really illogical. From 70 individuals, according to Genesis, that there were 70 individuals who came, and then they became 2 million in just a few centuries. So modern scholars, they reject it because they say this is exaggerated and implausible, especially under the kind of oppression they were saying that. Then they say that this is definitely ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the belief that your own culture or ethnic group is superior to other culture or ethnic groups. So they used to say we were better than them. That's why they were jealous of us. They were treating us really badly. They were scared of us. Some things are like true, but some of them are like really exaggerated. Because if we say that Banu Israel, mostly they were shepherds. They came from deserts, and Egyptian, they were rulers. So the Egyptians, they controlled wealth and power. The idea that Israelites could pose a demographic or military threat is inconsistent with the social hierarchy. So the real fear, or I can see that the real fear is like um, uh, Egyptians' concern was not that Israelites are more in strength, but I think they're mostly, um, you can say, their fear was about their disloyalty, especially when they were allied with Egypt's enemies, Hyksos and then Hittites, according to some historical references. This is rooted in their historical ties to the Hyksos. So, and culturally, Egyptians, they had social and cultural disdain for the Israelites, considering them impure and untrustworthy as well. So they used to call them, after Ahmose I, they used to call them leftovers of the foreign occupation. So the idea of about, we also hear that the forced labor was, they were treated like slave. They were 24 hours they used to be beaten up, and then they were forced to do labor. The Torah claims that Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, building the city of Pithom and Ramesses. If we see the Egyptian records, especially from Seti I and Ramesses II's time, it depicts laborers were treated well, like with living standards, not unlike those in modern times, like a proper living standards. And the way Ahmose, when he started his revival of Egypt, he asked every single citizen to take part in that, in building temples and restoring Egypt, because he was working on Egyptian identity. He had expelled all the foreigners from there, and he asked everybody. And the Egyptian, they did not, because they were living a life of privilege because of Hyksos, and all of a sudden they had to do the mandatory labor. They did not like it. So even at the Seti I and Ramesses time, Torah itself is like contradicting Israelites' claim, because when they were longing for Egypt after the Exodus, Moses al-Islam, he took them outside of Egypt, and they were getting all the blessings and manu salwa and everything. They started complaining about missing Egyptian food and opposing their departure from the start. So this suggests that they weren't mistreated and they were not slaves, but rather a privileged class under the Hyksos who were content when their favoritism ended. So after the Hyksos, the rebuilding of Egypt was done. So their refusal, driven by a loss of a privilege, may have led to rising tension and suspicion of treachery. So if we see how Egyptian laborers, they were treated in different times. So under different, like when they were doing different projects, we can see in the history, there's a book called Banu Israel by Muhammad Bayoumi Mehran. In chapter 1, the volume 1, the chapter, the oppression of the Israelites under pharaohs, he gives the detail how Seti I, he used to give the generous daily rations and clean clothing twice a month. It shows that humane treatment of workers, not because he was a really kind king, but he wanted all the laborers to work without creating any kind of chaos or any kind of rebellion. So Seti I, how he used to manage all these large construction projects, particularly temples and storage cities. He ensured that laborers, many of them who were foreigner captives and Israelites, they received measured food portions daily. And some of the Egyptian records, they depict labor supervision checking registers while scribe distributing provisions such as bread, onion, beer, and to call it dried fish. So these things, like, he did not want any kind of interruption, any kind of rebellion, any kind of chaos. So he was giving them, which is enough for any laborer to live a good life. So Quran is also supportive of saying that Israelites were definitely treated as one faction. And it was the time when Ramesses II time came. Ramesses II. So in Surah Al-Mu'minun, verse number 47, says, they said, shall we put faith in two mortals like ourselves when the people are slaves to us? So when but there's obviously a contradiction in the Torah itself, that they were you can say Ramesses II, he made two factions because he was scared of Bani Israel. They knew the Ramesses II, he knew that Bani Israel, they had lineage of prophets. So he was afraid anytime a prophet can come from their lineage, and obviously a Muslim, he knew about the, no matter what Bani Israel was doing, they had weak faith, and they were not on their deen. But Pharaoh knew how prophets come from their lineage, and if one prophet came from that, he would destroy everything, his godhead, his rulership, everything. So he was always afraid of them. So he treated them like a slave people, like somebody who would think that these people are beneath me. So treat them like a slave. Don't let them rise in their self-respect and worth, and treat them so badly that they would forget about rising, forget about rebellion against him. So in Torah, the Israelites themselves complained after the Exodus, longing for the comfort of Egypt, indicating they weren't subject to brutal slavery. So that thing was going on, that they were definitely treated as a faction, lower people, but that wasn't brutal. If it was that brutal, they would never long for Egypt. They would never crave for the food they used to eat in Egypt. And this is the form of mental slavery that the whole Bani Israel nation was gone into some kind of mental slavery. They were getting food, they were getting provisions. So even though they were treated like slaves, they had no problem with that because their basic needs were fulfilled. And when you fight for your freedom, you have to sacrifice your comfort, the first thing. And Musa alayhi salam, he took them out of Egypt like a free people, but they were not ready to let go of mental slavery. And if we see that how Ramesses, he used to kill the children, the sons of Israelites, they were like, he had made them really passive, submissive to slavery. He used to kill their sons. I'm not sure that if it's like a deliberate done openly, or it was done by what you say passively, like secret, in a secret way, because in Tafhimul Quran, Maulana Maududi, he suggests that there were some Egyptian midwives who were working on that, and they, whenever they would get to know that some woman is pregnant, they would keep an eye on her, like keep a watch on them and the whole family. And as soon as the child was born, they would report whether the baby was male or female. And if somebody even hide like some family hide the pregnancy from them, um, it's like a myth, not sure how true it is, but they would take a small kid with them, and some people say they would make the kid cry outside of their door. And kids, they somehow mimic, when one kid is crying, one baby is crying, the other baby would cry, and then they will get to know there's a newborn baby in this house. So they act like a spy, the Egyptian midwives. So there was a proper surveillance and systematic oppression going on. So Pharaoh was not spontaneous or impulsive, but highly structured and structured about this whole thing. And in one year he won't kill the sons, and other year he would kill them. Um, and he also created that division between Egyptian Copts and the Israelites. And he used the class division to justify brutality. And he made sure that he would keep on doing infanticide. So if any because when you make male of a society really weak, and then their women will also become weak, like naturally, because there won't be anybody to protect them, and there won't be anybody to take care of the family as a protector. So he somehow controlled all of that, and then he controlled the labor as well. So if we see Bani Israel, they were passive, submissive. They accepted humiliation under Pharaoh, especially the Ramesses II, the Pharaoh, and they had accepted slavery. But the real oppression started when he started the male infanticide. Then method of killing initially opened, then he systemized the killing with the midwife secretly executing male newborn. Then we have Quranic confirmation as well. It clearly shows that this was happening. So when Bani Israel, they settled first, initially in the time of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, they were enjoying all the privileges. But then generation after generation, they started forgetting their own deen. And the Egyptian, they also started forgetting the favors of Yusuf alayhi salam. So, and in that, if we say the labor time and the slave time, that they were doing the harsh labor and stuff, it did not show anywhere. And especially Muhammad Bayumi Mehran, he said that Bani Israel, they did not resist or revolt, but somehow the inferiority complex, it internalized, and it made them spiritually weak, and somehow socially stagnant as well, because they depended on Egyptian too much. They started accepting that we are lower than you. So we see this sounds so strange that one nation, their kids were being slaughtered, their sons were being slaughtered, and they didn't do anything. They remained silent. How they became so submissive? It must be that Pharaoh had created some kind of um, atmosphere of fear, and fear was so strong, they did not dare to say anything against it. So, and when I was talking about Seti I's provision, he was supplying them with the bread, onion, and dried fish, and clothing and footwear and everything. So he was somehow very calculatively and very precisely, he was maintaining the workers, and he was providing them with the comfort, so they can so it won't affect the ability of work. He had rules and regulation as well. So in Ramesses the second time and the Seti one time, they had really strict surveillance rules about workers. They used to monitor workers, laborers all the time. There was a daily attendance, it used to be recorded, and absence without cause was punishable. This is how he created the fear, how pharaohs created the fear. Then there was a work quota. Each group was required to complete a specific portion of construction work, like how many number of bricks or stones should be cut or made. So failure to meet the quota led to beating or reduced ration. They would take their food away, they would hit them as well. They used to give them punishment by whipping them or flogging them. So they were like whipping and flogging, they were like common punishments for disobedience. Slowness or escape attempts, if somebody tried to run, that was really, they used to give really strong punishment, like cutting a hand or a foot or something. Then they used to brand them, like branding marks with the, you can say, iron. Leave any slave who is like runaway slaves or laborers, they used to be identified by their branding mark, which they used to like like used to make on their body. There was no legal protection. Laborers, like especially Israelites, had no rights to appeal mistreatment. And any complaints, if they try to make any complaints, it were interpreted as a rebellion. So in the start, it was the slavery accepted by them. Then step by step in Seti 1 and Ramesses 2 time, they had they had factioned them on one side, like this is the lowest you can say lowest cost of the society. So they started treating them so badly that they would cut hand or beat them or brand them. Like branding was done really, like it was normal to shame them. So how Muhammad Bayoumi Mehran, he gives a critical view of how these provisions were not act of kindness. There was a system of exploitation. Then he made a systematic oppression of Egypt, like to break the spirit of Banu Israel, and then he kept them dependent. And there was even the food or clothing which was provided to Israelites, it was strictly controlled. And often when they would try to run away or say that I don't want to do work, they would be punished so severely. And they were these provisions which they used to provide them, food and stuff, they used to withhold them as a punishment. So this is like really contrasting that how these people were humiliated, and then they longed for Egypt and the comfort of Egypt. That slavery, those provisions, if you keep on doing everything without making any complaint about it, then you will keep on getting food, you will keep on getting clothing and footwear and everything. But if you make any complaints about it, you would get punishment. And even then they used to long for this discomfort. So you can see they were going through a mental slavery. And it's a big lie. Like, they twisted facts. Like, Jews, they mostly in the history, they have twisted the facts. So the way they twisted it is so difficult to even pinpoint where what was going on. But they started from accepting slavery, and they were very, very passive. And when you accept the slavery, like mental slavery, you become slave to that person already. Even though when their physical chains are not visible, that person will still become. And physical chains, when they are there, they will keep on reminding you that I'm a slave and I've been treated really badly. But when the chains are, they are invisible, you cannot see them. That's the mental slavery, and this is the worst part of the you can say slavery. So we can see a lot of psychological and social humiliation. And then there was a destruction of family structure by killing the male child. And then the way their moral, you can say their moral compass was lost. The way they were clinging to the material crumbs of the Egypt, despite all of the humiliation. This is the thing which is like shows the mental slavery. And how this whole book talks about Bani Israel is like really amazing book. I would actually suggest everybody to read it, but it's in Arabic and you can translate it with the different apps. So, and how Pharaoh was more, the strange thing about Banu Israel, they had forgotten about their legacy, but Pharaoh, he didn't. Pharaohs, they knew it that someday a prophet gonna born. But those people, Bani Israel, they had forgotten their lineage. So it's really strange because it shows the lack of critical analysis, lack of brainstorming. And under a man who is claiming to be a god, a godhead, people of, you can say, upholder of Deen was under the upholder of Math. So this is like one of the most heartbreaking truth as well, because if we look at the Jews, they've been twisting all the facts. I don't know how much they had twisted the facts about what happened in the time of World War, the way they said stuff about Hitler. He killed many of them, but you would see so many movies, so many books written about him. Hitler is the worst person in the history of mankind and all that stuff. But I don't know how much of that is true. It also needs some research. So that's it. If you want to ask the question, please go on.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Misbah. Does anybody wants to add something or any questions? Someone has commented in the chat that no question, only that I can see so many similarities between Bani Israel then and modern Muslim state of mind now. Yes, that's why we have selected this topic. So, any other questions?
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
Shabina, it's just an assessment, really. It's the mentality of the Israelites at the time. I think it continues, but it's sort of become for the current day Israels or Jews. They've put up a sort of a fight that we don't, because it's within it's historically and genetically it lies with them, because that's how they were treated, and it hasn't left them, but it's just morphed into something that now they aggressively address their own demise in history and want to not go back there again, and it's turned them into how they were treated. at the cost of treating other people. You know, you can see it, but it's in a you know, when some person or they lose their mind. So it's the whole, they've lost their mind now. When they think back historically, how over time, how their history has been, it's turned them into very, very aggressive. You know, they're meting out the same punishment. So obviously, when the British Empire colonized and 200 years of their superpower, how they treated other people, take it India, Pakistan, Africa, wherever they went, colonized, they did their own share of, you know, suppressing people and making people a slave, meted slavery upon them. But I think the problem with the Israelites is that their history keeps catching up with them. And obviously they've all as rich and developed and at the forefront of everything, business, wealth and everything. You know, it's really a defense mechanism for them not to ever go back to that state again. That's the way I see it.
And I actually see ethnocentrism as well.
Yeah.
When I talk about, like, they believe that their culture and ethnic group is superior to other culture or ethnic group.
Exactly. So it's more, you know, it's not to do with the religion anymore of Judaism, or it's really goes back to how they were treated. And even though they've been given the Torah, they had the Prophet Musa alayhi salam, but this existed before, and it just can't leave them. It just doesn't leave them. It stays with them like a shadow. And I don't know, it may never change. It may never change. And, you know, unfortunately, while they had, you know, even Prophet Musa alayhi salam tried to bring them to the path. I think it's like is somebody who's been affected, you know, badly, and it may lead them to hellfire. The way they're behaving now with other human beings. Unfortunately, Muslims are the victims. But if it wasn't Muslim, they'd probably do it to anybody else. So it's become a genetic thing rather than it's in their DNA rather than. At the moment, they're ruling. You know, they're ruling the world at the moment. But unfortunately, it's something that, you know, it niggles at their conscience all the time. I just want to share a bit, because when we came to this country, you know, it was the Jews who owned all the properties and businesses. They helped people, immigrants who came to the country. They were immigrants, we were immigrants, but you know, it wasn't they didn't have prejudice against immigrants at that time. I mean, they supported anybody who came in as immigrants. And they had wealth then. They were so wealthy, and they had so much business incentives, and very, very intelligent people. But it's a fear. I think they just still can't get over this fear of how they were treated in the past. And that's where it all originated from is it Egyptian mythology? You know, you have Greek mythology. Obviously, it wasn't real. It just was in their minds that they were gods. God Ra, a god of sun, and so this is built on this fake and this mythology that they created themselves. Obviously through black magic, through magic as well. But magic had power, but it was all very dark and very sinister.
What would you say how they're treating Palestine people?
Yeah, so it's not. It's like somebody's freaked out. You know, like it's like the story of Frankenstein. somebody, you know, they've suffered throughout time. We don't know, you know, how to compare the whole time scale. It's hundreds of years they've been, you know, treated like that. So if they, even if they look at their own history, it's you go to Germany and they, because of how Hitler, what he did in Germany, current day Germans, they can't put their head up, you know, they're quite embarrassed by what Hitler did. It's like as if Hitler's behavior, Hitler's atrocities that he meted out on people, they're having to carry the weight of it. You know, so it's a burden, as if Israelites are carrying a burden all the time. The Jews now, no matter how you listen to these settlers, they just, you know, they've just got to take. And never were the Palestinians, they were gentle people, very mild-mannered, very easygoing. They had a comfortable life, but they were never expecting that the Nakba and the genocide that took place then, that would be happening to. Otherwise, they would have prepared. They would never, you know, it just came upon them like a storm. They've never had battles. I don't know, you know, they've never had wars in which they could strategically how to defend themselves. They never defended themselves. They were just gathered and moved from one place to another and just taken over by a community that is just fighting to, you know, for their own existence in the right way or the wrong way. It's you know, it's just another phase the world's going through.
But they are the one, Jews are the one who are holding most of the media in their hand, most of the news.
They may well be. They may well be. That's a tool for them. That's just, you know, they've got everything. Because they're, you know, they've got, as Sahil Adim says, they've done it through hard work.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So we, not because they're Jew, but that hard work element, we have to give them their due. We have to give them their respect. He doesn't say, you know, that
you know, they lost their respect the way they treated the other people, like Palestinian. I mean, how can we respect them?
Because majority it's the create again is British, isn't it? The Zionist movement and the Zionist element of it. They've introduced when these Jews come out and rally with the Muslims and say it's not in our name.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of them that don't agree with what's happening, but they can't do anything because it's as if the governments have a hold on them. You know, the Zionists have a hold on all the governments, Muslim, non-Muslim. The Arabs are nowhere. The Arabs, you know, they have nothing to stand on. But the so-called superpowers, no, I don't include China because China is on a different chapter. But whereas America, you know, Europe, everybody else, Muslim countries, so-called Muslim countries, they have such a hold on them that they have to abide by what they want. I mean, even the millions and billions of pounds, you know, that number has no meaning. You know, they've got access. Just yesterday or today, they've got the most nuclear bombs, more than ever. But even it's not enough. It's not enough. They're the most threat in the area, you know, and they want to eradicate all the Arab countries. Now they're after Iran. But they themselves, they're holding on to the maximum number of nuclear heads, you know, and if this is for them to what they're doing with Gaza. It's just like they're playing with them, you know, cat and mouse. And they're just
the Jews you're talking about, they're like very few in numbers.
they're not. They're a we can't count them because they're, you know, they don't stand out, you know, you can't identify a Jew. You can't, they haven't got, we have our mosques, the men our dress identify as Muslims, but they are huge in numbers. It's just that we can't see them. They're
Yes.
everywhere, you know, and they believe in the same procreating as well. They've got a philosophy. Their rabbis introduce, you know, that you must increase your numbers, and they give them incentives. You know, we've got an area in London, Hendon, and you know and Stamford Hill. That is the hub of the Jews in London. Stamford Hill. They're so rich. I mean, you take Lord Sugar. You know, the he's got an unmeasurable amount of income, and what they look after their own. You know, we can't look after our own. They spend money on old age people's home. They support themselves, you know, each other, families increasing in numbers. So they for themselves are very good, you know, and the way they do it, they're not doing it in exchange to hold other people back, but they're doing it just to promote themselves in their own way. And I've known first from first hand, you know, Jews, they're not all what Zionism and Jews are two different entities. The mischief makers are, and they're a monster created by, you know, because the British, they love to create problems. They love it. They just find some sort of amusement. For them, it's like an amusement, you know, in the old Roman times when the gladiators are used to in the rings, you know, it was like they'd all cheered on the gladiators as they killed each other. They're bloodthirsty. You know, it's like if you know about Rome and their culture, how they used for their pastime, you know, if they wanted to watch a good film, they'd go to the rings and arenas and watch a good gladiator fight.
I think British people, they are like passive. Even British government, they will wait for orders from America rather than being a mischief maker. I think American government, their president, their government, they are mischief makers, and British government, they are followers.
Yeah, it seems like that, but really they're students of the British. You know, they're a few steps behind. I know this conversation is going, you know, somewhere else, but we need to you know, see who the real enemy is and where the real threat is coming from. It's not general, you know, there are a few, and who is the facade, who's actually fitna, who's the people who, it's the British, absolutely, all the time, since Queen Victoria sent Sir Raleigh out. You know, the Spanish, they fought the Spaniards and wherever, and they just went forward and forward. And the slavery, I was listening to a scholar, Dr. Tariq Swaida, and he was saying, you know, the biggest business the Arab had in their time was slavery. So it was it was more prominent, more widespread slavery with the Arabs. You get a very interesting talk. I'd love to put it up for everybody to listen.
Can I add something?
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, please.
Okay, so one thing very obviously, this is my opinion, that we need to take accountability, correct? As a Muslim, we don't. And that is the root cause of it. You know, we keep on blaming the government and all those things. They are there, correct? But ourselves, we don't take accountability. We pass on to somebody else. Like khatib is the job to do imamat, correct? Why can't head of the family cannot do imamat, correct? So a lot of things. So we don't take responsibility. That is the problem in America and other places, and I bring it up. And that is a core issue. Means Muslims, a lot of places, they don't even consider major depressive disorder as a disease,
Mm.
and they are in IMS running the show. Correct? So these are the problems. I have identified those people, but they're still there at the top. From England, running IMS, calling a major depressive disorder not a disease. So when we have like these thinkers, for God's sake, if you are a slave, you're lucky. If you're a slave, you're lucky. They're giving some water and food, you're lucky. This is your thinking is, and you're running IMS with that thought process as a head. So this is the problem. We keep on blaming the government. Yes, governments are responsible. I agree on that. But we have to take accountability too. Correct? That's my view of thinking, but maybe you may have a different way of thinking. But in America, that's what we think.
Yes, Jazakallah khair for adding the points. When we will discuss more about the Bani Israel, we will find the root cause. What was the root cause? They, every time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them some responsibility, they broke the promise. Every time they broke the promise. So this is the root cause, and we will discuss it. The thing is that we as a Muslim, we do not owe our own book. We do not owe our own deen. That's the problem. Just like at that time, Bani Israel have the Suhufi Ibrahim. They were from the, Ibrahim alayhi salam has trained those people, but they have forgotten everything. They were just under the, we can say, the superpower of that time. They just leave their own book. And as the Sister Rubina was telling, that now, yes, they have a fear. They know that if they did not do these things, again they will went into the under a kind of another superpower. So they know that what kind of strategies they have to adopt. And also, at the time when they invade the Palestine. So yes, at the time those people were not ready to fight back, because they do not have any kind of strategy. They were waiting for other Arab countries that they will come and defend them, but nobody came. So yes, we need a strategy before a tough time came upon us, and that's why we are having these sessions, so that we will learn from history that what kind of mistakes the people have made in the history, and at what point we are now, and what we have to do now. So, Jazakallah khair, Sister Misbah, for the presentation, and
Jazak.
everybody else for adding the points. Yes,
Can I just add something? You know, as
yes,
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to us in the Quran, that if you Muslims of this time don't do what you have to do, I'll wipe you out. You understand? So we need to either wake up, you know, unite, have a goal, a common goal, and become active and move forward, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, he's not telling anybody else of any other faith. He's talking to the Muslims that if you don't if you don't do what you were supposed to do, I'm going to remove you and replace you with another people. You know, so we either we up our game, as they say, you know, do what we have to do, and then then we have to move out the way and let some other generation come along and fulfill all the all the duties of a Muslim. So we
Of
can
society.
keep going round in circles. We can keep going round and round in circle. We're not doing this, we're not doing that. That's right, we're not. Look inwards. If we look at ourselves, look at our own communities, how they behave. You know, if you're in a social work, my daughter is a social worker for a local authority, and she comes to me and she says, our own people, you know, their own mentality. They'd love to live in this low places, you know, no education, no etiquette, no deen, nothing. They've got no direction in life. They're just being, you know, they're happy to be pushed around from one place to another.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's like we have
Yes.
to look at our own self.
It's because we have adopted the wrong definitions of Islam. That's why.
Well, okay, if it's a definition, then let's look at how we are defining Islam and
Yeah.
whose job it is to define Islam. You know, everybody's got the book, everybody's got the Quran, everybody's got access to tafsir, Arabic, English, Urdu, every translation, you know, it's been translated for us, but we just can't agree on what is the, you know, what is the path. But
Yeah.
inshallah, you know, we pray
Yeah,
that
but
Allah guides
yes,
us.
there are lots of things on it. The one of the major thing is that we, as a Muslim, we think that tafsir is the deen, you know, but we should think that tafsir is just the research of a person. So we need to understand the Quran. We need to define our definitions through Quran, what Quran is saying. So
Or the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi
yeah, yes,
wasallam.
of
You know,
course, the Sira, yes,
when he
Sira
came to
life.
Medina, you know, in the years he was in Makkah, it was all about Tawheed, you know, waking people up to the oneness. And then when he came to Medina, that's where the real work started. You know, that's where, because we came from, you know, Muslims came, emigrated, and they, you know, how the helpers in Saris, just they gave everything. You know, they were better Muslims. Were they the better Muslims? You know, so we're not going to migrate anymore. We're not going to migrate like a huge numbers from here to there as the Muslims did. But we, at least we can become like the Ansars, help each
Yeah.
other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Jazakallah khair, Sister Rubina, for adding beautiful points. So, inshallah, see you everyone in the next Sira session. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله.